So the climax of this year's season of Doctor Who is fast approaching, and the question on everybody's lips is, who is Mrs. Flood? This mysterious character played by Anita Dobson, who has been cropping up all over the 15th Doctor's era. Firstly, of course, in the church on Ruby Road, then a handful of times throughout season 1, and of course in every single episode of season 2. I've been covering the Mrs. Flood mystery on the channel every step of the way, right from the start in 2023, but more recently with weekly videos. First of all, one covering everything we knew about her so far prior to the start of season 2, and then analysing her appearances in The Robot Revolution, Lux, The Well, and Lucky Day. This week's video is going to be a little bit different to usual because it does feel now like the big reveal about Mrs. Flood is not too far away, whether it comes this week in the Interstellar Song Contest or next week in Wish World, who knows. But yes, I want to take stock of everything we know about her so far and lay down some final predictions about who she could be, what might go down. But first of all, just to briefly address her most recent appearance in The Story and the Engine. Not a load to talk about there. We see her in the flashback to that story about Belinda saving a woman's life in the hospital that she works in. You know, Belinda is kind of on her way out, or like walking one way down a corridor. Mrs. Flood is walking in, she waves to her. The two acknowledge each other. You know, obviously we know that Belinda thinks that Mrs. Flood is her next door neighbour, and Mrs. Flood says that she's just there to pick up some pills. Obviously people say, like, why would she be at a hospital to collect pills? Surely she'd go to like a pharmacist or something for that, or a chemist, but hey, who knows. But yeah, she just literally walks past, and that is it. That's the extent of Mrs. Flood's contribution to this week's story, which I'm not entirely mad about, because I think, you know, by this point, we've seen her loads already. It's okay to have a more kind of low-key appearance for her, one which you could miss if you weren't specifically looking out for it. Yeah, quite low-key, quite subtle, quite reminiscent of what we've seen already from her. Like, I think the costume is even recycled from some of her previous appearances in season 1, or like it's a variation of that kind of costume she wore as Ruby's neighbour. At the same time, I do think there's only so long you can kind of keep on going with this whole thing of just having her crop up, and having such a kind of brief appearance from her this week, I think, really sets the scene, hopefully, for something more substantial in the Interstellar Song Contest, which we know she's in. We've seen clips of her in the trailers already with her opera glasses and a fancy outfit and her hair in a bun and a little flask of tea saying, oh, I love a good show. So yes, we'll get onto that in just a moment. But there was something else I wanted to touch on from The Story and the Engine, which could potentially link to Mrs. Flood, based on a comment that Anita Dobson made at a convention, about a year or so ago. And this all hinges on the little girl that Belinda sees when she's wandering around the streets of Lagos looking for the Doctor, looking for Omo's barbershop. The girl who was in fact played by the same actor, the same child actor, who played Captain Poppy in Space Babies, which I didn't catch on first watch whatsoever. It went completely over my head. I kind of checked social media afterwards and I was like, oh my god, hang on a minute, yeah, that was her. So I don't blame you at all if it went over your head as well. But it's very interesting, this, because in both cases, the actor is actually credited as Poppy, the same name being used, which would imply the same character. But then, why would like one of the Space Babies be in Lagos, Nigeria in 2019? Now, it could just be a sly nod, you know, back to Space Babies, like saying, okay, we've got the same actor back for this role, so we'll tie it together, we'll use the same name. It could just be like a nod to the fact that Space Babies, like The Story and the Engine, was very tied up with the idea of what stories are, like as a kind of thematic thing. In both cases, there is an engine which is like powered by stories or creates stories. So in Space Babies, the space station computer, which kind of misunderstands and creates this bogeyman. Alternatively, there could be something bigger going on involving Mrs. Flood. So this comment that Anita Dobson made at a convention way back when, I think kind of once season 1 had aired, or some of it had aired, but before season 2, was, you know, looking ahead to season 2 and her appearances, you know, this year, and the big reveal about who she is. You know, by this point, she knew what was going on. She'd filmed season 2, the climax of season 2, and she was kind of saying how, you know, she was watching Space Babies when it went out, and she was thinking, oh my god, like, what is this? This doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And then she got the script for the season 2 finale, or the stuff that was coming up at that point. And then apparently after that, the whole Space Babies thing made more sense. And I think around the same time there was actually speculation that one of the actors who'd played on the Space Babies was back in season 2 in the finale, which could still transpire, or maybe wires were getting crossed there, and it was actually what we've seen here with Captain Poppy returning in the story and the engine. But yes, that's all very, very intriguing indeed, and it leads us on nicely to the climax of season 2 and making some final predictions about who Mrs. Flood could be, what she's up to. I mean, for instance, if there was some link between Mrs. Flood and the Space Babies, perhaps she was the one that sabotaged the baby station and the birth machine, or whatever it was that was kind of keeping the babies being born. Perhaps they were kind of like her lab rats, like part of an experiment that she was conducting, and she's, like, to all intents and purposes, their mother or their grandmother. Some kind of link like that would kind of be quite cool, I think. I'd be kind of up for seeing that. As someone who wasn't massively wild on Space Babies, it'd be really nice to kind of go back to that story and say, actually, there was like a broader significance to what was going on here, and right under your nose this whole time there's been this massive scheme at work. On a similar note, I can't help but wonder what Mrs. Flood's connection to the Pantheon of Gods is going to be, because presumably there is going to be something that presumably she's working with them or for them or above them or whatever. She's the big boss of the Pantheon, perhaps, I don't know. But it would certainly make sense, because the Pantheon has been such a big thing for the past few years of Doctor Who. It makes sense for that to be kind of reaching some kind of climax here at the same time as the Mrs. Flood storyline. I've never been massively convinced by the whole idea that Mrs. Flood is the god of stories. I always kind of thought that was more of a fan rumour than anything that might actually happen on the show itself. And I think particularly now that we've seen Anansi, the god of stories, mentioned in this week's episode in the story and the engine, and also not as part of the Pantheon, that to me again kind of rules that out as an option. But keeping to the Space Babies theory, an idea that I do quite like is that Mrs. Flood actually created the Pantheon of Gods. Like, she is the kind of the creator of the creators, the god of all gods almost. And we had Sutekh as the one who waits, apparently as the head of the Pantheon. But if someone had actually kind of created the Pantheon to begin with, then that would kind of put her on a higher plane. It wouldn't exactly explain why she was dusted by Sutekh in last year's finale, unless she was just like going along with things, playing along, pretending to not be as powerful as she was. But I think that would kind of make sense, actually, almost, and maybe even like make people appreciate the Pantheon of the Gods more. Once again, it could be something along the lines of Mrs. Flood kind of conducting experiments and literally making the gods the Pantheon in like petri dishes. Coming up with Maestro, like, oh, I'm going to make a music god. Oh, we're going to make a god of light. Here's Mr. Ring-a-Ding. Even with Sutekh, kind of going back to the classic series and retroactively sort of making Sutekh a creation of Mrs. Flood. The same thing with the Toymaker. Hey, here's a god of games. Now, if you combine all of this with RTD's love of anagrams or puns, the whole thing with Sutekh and, Sutekh that we had last year, Mrs. Flood, people have been saying this since the start, but Mrs. Flood, Flood, Rain is an anagram of Rani. The idea that Mrs. Flood would be the Rani, on the one hand, does seem completely ridiculous and baffling, and this character who's not been seen since the classic series, hiding away as an old woman on Earth, why would she be doing that? But of course, the big thing about the Rani as a character is her love of science. In the classic series, she had all these experiments like dinosaur embryos and all this stuff going on. In both her appearances, that was her thing, her kind of angle. In the same way that for the meddling monk, it's like meddling with history, and for the master, it's kind of a more general love of chaos, but it all kind of goes back to him wanting to be the Doctor's friend. The science thing is what makes the Rani different and distinctive and unique as a character. And I do think, if all this stuff was played up, if the Space Babies, the gods, or whatever, the Bone Beasts, in the finale, if these things were all creations of hers, experiments of hers, that could actually start to fit, and I could actually start to see Mrs. Flood being the Rani, as ridiculous as it sounds. And just to add to that as well, if we do get the reveal in the Interstellar Song Contest, I think it would be so funny and memorable if Mrs. Flood literally got onto the stage for the song contest and started singing, and that was how we found out who she is and what she's up to. Anita Dobson can sing, she's sung in the past, she's got albums and singles and stuff, so there is certainly a precedent for it. But yes, that is where I stand with Mrs. Flood at the moment in terms of final hopes and predictions, as baffling as they perhaps sound. Maybe I'll be back next week with egg on my face, but hey, there we go. But what are your final predictions for Mrs. Flood, and what do you think of the theories I've discussed in this video? What is your theory about the Space Baby link? How does that fit together, the whole thing with Captain Poppy? Is there a link there? Let me know all of your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. I would love to hear what you've got to say. Please leave a like if you have enjoyed this video, and subscribe to the channel if you're new, because we're really trying to get to 9,000 subscribers at the moment, and we're really very close. But otherwise, until the next one, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.